Before you decide this message isn't about you, let me ask you something. What if every scroll, every screenshot, every quiet check of their profile is doing something you never intended, not bringing you closer to understanding them, but slowly pulling you further away from the version of yourself that could actually draw them back? What if the hours spent analyzing their last post, their new follower, the story they viewed but never mentioned, have been feeding an anxious energy that, without you even realizing it, radiates outward into every part of your life, including the very connection you're trying so hard to protect? Most people believe that watching closely, staying informed, keeping tabs on someone's digital footprint, is simply a form of caution, a reasonable way to manage uncertainty in an uncertain situation. But there is a psychological cost to this behavior that rarely gets discussed honestly. Constant surveillance of another person's life, even when it feels productive or protective, keeps your nervous system locked in a state of vigilance that is exhausting, corrosive, and, paradoxically, often pushes away the very outcome you're hoping to create. Right now, you may be caught in exactly this cycle. Checking their profile before checking your own reflection in the morning. Noticing every small change, a new photo, a different bio, a friend who likes something, and building entire narratives from fragments that were never meant to tell a complete story. This constant monitoring may feel like control. In reality, it is often the opposite, a symptom of feeling entirely out of control, using information as a substitute for the security you actually need to feel from within. This chapter isn't about pretending you don't care, or forcing yourself to stop caring through sheer willpower. It's about understanding something far more powerful than surveillance ever could be, the specific shift in energy, in nervous system state, in your entire way of showing up in the world, that tends to change dynamics far more reliably than any amount of watching from a distance. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to gather more information. It's to finally stop needing it, and to discover what becomes available to you, and to the relationship, once you do. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear may completely change the way you understand attention, energy, and the quiet transformation that happens when you finally stop watching someone else's life and start fully living your own. Have you ever noticed that the moments you feel most at peace are rarely the moments right after checking their profile? That gap between the habit and the actual feeling it produces is worth paying very close attention to. Constantly monitoring someone's social media activity might feel, in the moment, like a form of managing anxiety, gathering information to reduce uncertainty about where things stand. But the psychological reality is often the opposite of what this behavior promises. Rather than reducing anxiety, habitual surveillance tends to reinforce and intensify it, creating a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to interrupt the longer it continues. Each time you check their profile, your nervous system engages in a small but real stress response, scanning for potential threats, meaning, and confirmation of your worst fears. Even when nothing alarming is found, this repeated activation keeps your body in a low-grade state of vigilance, similar to the hypervigilance associated with chronic anxiety. Over time, this constant activation becomes exhausting, not just emotionally, but physiologically, contributing to disrupted sleep, difficulty concentrating, and an overall sense of being perpetually on edge. There is also a significant cognitive distortion that tends to develop through this pattern. Social media presents an inherently incomplete, curated version of anyone's life. A single photo, post, or interaction gets interpreted and expanded into an entire narrative, often filled with assumptions that have little basis in actual fact. This process, sometimes described as catastrophizing or filling in gaps with anxiety-driven stories, tends to intensify distress far beyond what the actual, limited information would reasonably justify. Perhaps most significantly, this habitual monitoring keeps your attention, your emotional energy, and your sense of identity anchored almost entirely outside yourself, oriented around someone else's activity rather than your own life, growth, and well-being. This external orientation is not simply an inconvenience. It represents a genuine displacement of the energy and attention that would otherwise be available for building the kind of internal security and personal fulfillment that tends to be genuinely attractive and stabilizing, both for yourself and within relationships. This is one of the most important, and most counterintuitive, truths about this pattern. The very behavior that feels like it's helping you stay connected to and informed about the relationship is often actively undermining the internal state that would make you most capable of showing up in that relationship, or any relationship, from a place of genuine security rather than anxious monitoring. The shift required to interrupt this pattern is not simply behavioral, deciding to delete an app or block a profile, though these actions can certainly support the process. The deeper shift involves a fundamental change in where your attention and emotional energy are primarily invested, moving from external monitoring toward internal presence and genuine engagement with your own life. This shift often begins with directly acknowledging the actual function this surveillance has been serving. In most cases, checking someone's social media repeatedly is not really about gathering useful information. It is an attempt to manage an underlying feeling of uncertainty or anxiety through the temporary, illusory sense of control that information provides. Recognizing this function honestly is important, because it clarifies that the actual problem being addressed is not a lack of information about them. It is a need for greater internal stability within yourself. As this recognition takes hold, the practical work involves redirecting the time, attention, and emotional energy previously spent on surveillance toward activities and practices that genuinely build internal security, meaningful engagement with your own goals, reconnecting with neglected friendships, physical movement, creative pursuits, or simply being fully present in your actual daily life rather than mentally absent, preoccupied with someone else's digital footprint. This redirection is rarely comfortable initially. The urge to check, to look, to gather one more piece of information, often intensifies before it diminishes, similar to how any habitual behavior tends to produce increased cravings when first interrupted. Understanding this in advance can help you tolerate the discomfort without immediately returning to the old pattern the moment it becomes difficult. As this shift genuinely takes hold, something significant begins to change in your overall energy, not through performance or forced positivity, but through authentic redirection of attention and investment. This shift often becomes noticeable to others, even without any explicit announcement or explanation. People tend to sense, on some level, when someone's energy is anchored in genuine internal security versus anxious external monitoring, even when they cannot articulate exactly what they're perceiving. This is often why this specific energy shift tends to have such a significant impact on relationship dynamics, not because it involves any conscious tactic or strategy, but because it fundamentally changes the quality of presence you bring to every interaction and every area of your life. It might seem paradoxical that reducing your focus on someone would tend to increase their interest or draw them closer, but this pattern reflects a consistent psychological principle worth understanding clearly. People are generally drawn toward energy that feels stable, secure, and self-sufficient, and tend to instinctively pull away from energy that feels anxious, dependent, or oriented entirely around their attention and approval. This is not a conscious calculation most people make. It operates at a largely unconscious level, an instinctive response to differing types of energy that most people cannot fully articulate but readily sense and respond to nonetheless. When your energy has been anchored in anxious monitoring, checking, analyzing, waiting for signs, this state often, even unintentionally, communicates a kind of neediness or preoccupation that can create subtle pressure in a relationship, even when nothing is said directly. The other person may not consciously identify this pressure, but many people report feeling a kind of unconscious urge to create distance when they sense someone's emotional stability depends heavily on their own behavior or attention. As your energy shifts toward genuine internal security, less oriented around monitoring their activity and more invested in your own fulfilling life, this pressure naturally begins to dissipate. Paradoxically, this often creates more room for genuine interest and attraction to develop or resurface, precisely because the anxious pressure that was inadvertently pushing them away has been removed. It's important to understand that this shift is not primarily a strategy designed to manipulate someone's feelings through calculated withdrawal. Approached purely as a tactic, with the underlying anxiety still fully intact and simply hidden rather than genuinely transformed, this shift is unlikely to produce meaningful results, because anxious energy, even when consciously suppressed on the surface, still tends to leak through in ways that undermine genuine security. The shift only works reliably when it reflects authentic internal change, not simply performed detachment covering unresolved anxiety underneath. If you genuinely engage in this internal shift, redirecting your energy toward real security and fulfillment rather than surveillance and anxious monitoring, the resulting change in how you show up may indeed influence the relationship dynamic. But this change in you remains valuable and significant regardless of whether it produces the specific outcome you may be hoping for with this particular person. Genuinely interrupting a pattern of habitual social media surveillance requires more than simply deciding to stop. It requires actively building new habits and internal resources that make stepping away from the old pattern sustainable, rather than a temporary act of willpower that eventually gives way back to the familiar behavior. Creating concrete structural barriers can provide meaningful initial support. This might involve muting or unfollowing the person's account temporarily, removing easy access that makes impulsive checking simple and automatic. While this step alone will not resolve the underlying anxiety driving the behavior, it can create helpful friction that gives you a moment to pause and choose differently rather than defaulting immediately to the habitual response. Identifying your specific triggers is equally important. Many people notice that the urge to check social media intensifies during particular times, moments of boredom, loneliness, uncertainty, or specific emotional triggers related to the relationship itself. Recognizing these specific triggers allows you to develop alternative responses in advance, a different activity, a call to a friend, a brief mindfulness practice, that you can turn to instead of defaulting immediately to surveillance when these triggers arise. Building genuinely fulfilling routines outside the relationship provides some of the most important, sustainable support for this shift. Investing seriously in physical health, meaningful work, creative projects, and relationships with friends and family provides your nervous system with concrete evidence that your life remains full and meaningful independent of this one uncertain situation. This is not simply distraction. It is active reconstruction of a sense of identity and fulfillment that does not depend entirely on monitoring someone else's life. Practicing tolerance of uncertainty without immediately seeking resolution through information gathering is a skill that develops gradually through consistent practice, not something achieved instantly through decision alone. Each time you notice the urge to check and choose, instead, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, you are building genuine capacity to tolerate uncertainty, a capacity that ultimately serves you far beyond this single situation. Finally, working with a therapist, particularly one familiar with anxiety and attachment patterns, can provide significant additional support for understanding and interrupting the cycle, especially if the underlying anxiety driving the surveillance connects to deeper patterns around trust, security, or earlier experiences of uncertainty and loss. Because this shift is primarily internal, its early signs often show up within your own experience before any external dynamic visibly changes. One of the clearest signs is a noticeable reduction in the frequency and intensity of the urge to check their social media, not through forced suppression, but through a genuine decrease in the anxious energy that previously drove the behavior. You may notice periods of time passing where the thought simply doesn't arise with its previous urgency, evidence that your underlying emotional state has genuinely shifted rather than you simply exercising increased willpower to resist an unchanged urge. Another significant sign is an improved capacity to tolerate not knowing. Where uncertainty about their activity or feelings may have previously felt unbearable, driving compulsive checking, you may notice yourself able to sit with that same uncertainty with considerably more ease, trusting your own stability rather than needing constant external information to feel secure. You may also notice a shift in where your genuine interest and attention naturally gravitate. Rather than their profile representing the most compelling, urgent thing in your daily awareness, your own projects, relationships, and goals may begin occupying that position instead, not through forced redirection, but through authentic renewed investment in your own life. Physical signs often accompany this shift as well: improved sleep, reduced overall anxiety, a general sense of increased energy and lightness that comes from no longer carrying the constant low-grade vigilance that surveillance behavior tends to require. As with any significant behavioral and emotional shift, this process is unlikely to be perfectly linear. There will likely be moments of relapse, situations that trigger a return to old checking patterns despite genuine overall progress. This does not indicate failure. It indicates that you are human, engaged in a genuinely difficult process of changing a deeply ingrained pattern, one that improves gradually through consistent practice rather than through a single decisive moment of change. It's worth being direct about something important. If you approach this shift purely as a clever strategy to manipulate someone into returning or paying more attention to you, it is far less likely to produce the genuine internal change necessary to make it actually effective. This shift only becomes truly powerful when it stops being primarily about influencing their behavior and becomes, instead, about genuinely reclaiming the significant time, attention, and emotional energy you've been investing in monitoring someone else's life rather than building your own. The security and fulfillment you're cultivating through this process are not meant to be a performance designed purely to attract a specific response. They are meant to be genuinely real, valuable regardless of whether this particular situation resolves the way you hope. This distinction matters because energy that has been authentically redirected toward genuine fulfillment and security tends to be sustainable and stable over time, while energy that remains secretly anxious underneath a performed detachment tends to eventually reveal that underlying anxiety in other ways, undermining the very stability the shift was meant to create. When you approach this work authentically, focused on reclaiming your own life and building genuine internal security rather than purely as a strategy to influence someone else's behavior, you build something valuable regardless of the outcome. If the relationship dynamic does shift favorably as a result, you meet that shift from a place of genuine security rather than continuing the same anxious pattern that originally contributed to the difficulty. If the relationship does not unfold the way you hope, you are left not with a failed strategy, but with a genuinely more fulfilling, secure version of your own life, built through consistent, authentic effort regardless of anyone else's response. If you've spent significant time and energy monitoring someone's social media, analyzing fragments of their life for meaning and reassurance that never quite arrives, understand that this pattern likely developed from genuine care and genuine anxiety about uncertainty, not from any personal failing or weakness. But the peace, security, and genuine attraction you're hoping to create were never actually going to be found through more information, more watching, more analysis of someone else's curated digital footprint. They found, instead, through the deliberate, sometimes difficult work of returning your attention and energy to your own life, building the kind of internal security that no amount of surveillance could ever provide. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this message reached something in you, I hope it offered a little relief from the exhausting cycle of watching and waiting, and a little clarity about where genuine security and attraction actually come from. This has been the Archetype Awakening. I hope this video helped you release the habit of surveillance and reminded you that the most powerful energy you can bring to any relationship isn't more attention paid to them. It's a genuinely full, secure life that no longer requires their activity to feel at peace. Wishing you the freedom of finally putting down what was never serving you, the clarity to trust your own worth independent of what you observe from a distance, and the quiet strength that comes from choosing your own life first. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.